What's going on, Badge Nation? Welcome to the PPC Den podcast, your home for all things Amazon advertising tips, tricks, strategies, all to make your Amazon advertising life a little bit easier and a little bit more profitable. So I love the topic of the episode that I just recorded with Alfredo, who's a PPC manager at AdBadger. Amazon did a little silent update where they didn't really tell anyone, even though it's a gigantic deal. Basically, they changed the way that broad match behaves for sponsored products, and they basically made it a lot more broad. If you were advertising in like the 2017, 2018 range, on Amazon, they actually put it back to the way that it was. So it's sort of reverted back. So they made it truly broad. We're going to talk about what that means, what your homework is. We give you a spreadsheet to help you with the transition from the old style broad to the new style broad, what you need to know about the change, and all that goodness. You can get the link in the description for all the freebies that we've ever had over the last 200 episodes of this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Now let's get to the episode.
I've launched campaigns and picked keywords. I've got my bids, set placements too, and bad mistakes. I've made a few. I've had my share of broad keywords, but I've gone through. We are the PPC Den, my friends, and we'll keep up the rising to the end. You two are the PPC Den. We talk about Amazon. No time for mannequins, 'cause we fix the gambit of the world.
I'm fired up, Alfredo.
Let's get it. Episode 215.
I'm so fired up. I'm mad too.
when we're mad, there's an opportunity.
Yes. So, number one, Amazon changed broad, and it's a pretty gigantic deal. So today we're going back to basics. Would you believe it, Alfredo? I bet you will. AdBadger's podcast first talked about modified broad in, when did we talk about it? I want to say 2018. Talked about it in like 2018, modified broad, maybe 2019. We got a lot to unpack, basically. The thing that we have to unpack is that the way that everybody was using broad for sponsored products needs to change today. Because the way that people have been using broad, I actually think that this was a huge error, from Amazon, like somebody messed up over there, because anyone who's ever used broad for sponsored brands versus broad for sponsored products knows how different these things are. Like broad for sponsored brands, crazy broad. Broad for sponsored products behaved like modified broad. It behaved way differently, because if you had a keyword for broad on sponsored products for the last 4 years, every single word in your broad match keyword for sponsored products needed to be in the search query. So if you had a broad match keyword for sponsored products, mason jar broad sponsored products, I will only appear for search terms where people are searching something with the word mason jar in it. I could appear for soup mason jar because it's got mason jar in it. I could appear for mason cooking jars. I could have appeared for that because it's got the word mason jars in it. Anything with mason jars, I would have appeared for. That changed in January 2023. Now, if I bid on mason jars, it's true broad. I could appear for things like cooking jars, doesn't have the word mason in it. I could appear for mason cooking ware, doesn't even have the word jar in it.
Glass bottle, right?
Potentially, right? We're now going to appear for synonyms of your broad match in sponsored products, stems of those synonyms. So like mason jar to glass bottle. Yeah, that's probably something you could appear for, because like, okay, jar, mason jars are glass. That's kind of related to glass jar. Like we need to start thinking of sponsored product broad match like true broad match. So we got a lot to unpack. There's some homework. Everyone needs to go into the spreadsheet. We include a link in this description. We included every single podcast episode where we have all the freebies that we've ever had on the show. You need to go and get that spreadsheet, find the modified broad spreadsheet, and all of your sponsored product broad match keywords. You need to put them into the spreadsheet, which will add the plus sign next to it. When you have that plus sign next to it, then you re-upload those keywords, and it will get your campaigns to behave the way that they have been behaving. Okay, Alfredo, I just talked for about 4 minutes. Basically, this morning we had somebody from our PPC team go in and say, yo, everyone's got to change their sponsored product broad match keywords because they are finally truly broad. We won't share the keywords or anything like that, but I almost want to go to the example that he had because it was pretty alarming. Let's look at this. Screenshot of a campaign that was targeting a branded keyword of a competitor. The bids, so we were trying to win the auction. And then, it was targeting a lot of things that did not have the brand name in it. So he was targeting a competitor that had the brand name in it. And then all of a sudden, there was a switch that happened in January where now all of a sudden, the name of that competitor. So like, let's just say the competitor was Nike. So he had like Nike shoes that he was targeting. And for the longest time, Nike shoes was in the search terms. And now Nike's not in the search terms. Shoes doesn't need to be in the search terms. Like it really got pretty wild. So broad has changed. So broad will truly be broad. It'll be like it was in sponsored brands. It'll be like sponsored brands broad, which I don't think people fully grasped that sponsored product broad was different than sponsored brand broad for the longest time. How often did you use sponsored brand broad, sponsored product broad? I think everybody uses a lot of sponsored product broad.
I think for me, it was the expectation that broad was almost behaving, like we said, like a shuffle phrase. That when we put the broad targets in, we knew we were going to get those broad keywords coming out in the search terms, just we didn't have to guarantee the order.
Right.
And that was how it was working for the longest.
They were great.
Yeah.
They were great. They're like I think people viewed broad match like a performance match type for the longest time, where it's like, oh, like I expect a certain level of performance in terms of conversions and ACoS out of my broad match keywords. And that's like not the spirit of broad match keywords. Like the spirit of broad match keywords is to be the wild match type, to be the match type where you find stems of those words, where you find new things. And it's a research tool. And it should be like a very tiny percent of your campaigns. But for a lot of people, it was making up like 50-60% of their spend for sponsored products, which was fine because it was behaving like modified broad match. Or this, I like to think of modified broad match, just like you said, as shuffle phrase. You want to explain that?
So when if we're targeting glass mason jar, we put that in phrase. We know we can have any set of terms, but glass mason jar has to stay intact as a term. It's not necessarily going to move around. Mm-hmm. So we wouldn't expect mason jar glass, right, coming out of a phrase. But in broad, we would expect that, right? We could expect these terms to come out in any type of order, but we know the terms are there. Right now, without the plus sign, we don't know if the terms are going to be there.
That's right.
And they could not.
Yeah. So let's break this down. Let's take it from basics, right? Match type basics, because now all the match types in sponsored products, sponsored brands are behaving the same way. It's worth refreshing. I love this topic because I think it's so fundamental in understanding like PPC strategy, search strategy. Let's start with the most precise. Exacto. So that is at the sort of the top of the pyramid for being the most precise keyword type. And let's break that down for us.
It's awesome. Sometimes you can get those short queries that are high volume, but they're expensive, right? And you have to know what you're doing on those bids. And you can use, we have other episodes going into revenue per click. And you can really say, hey, how am I converting on this term? I know the value it is for me of this term.
Yeah, if you bid on the exact match, that's what you're going to appear for. Maybe misspellings.
And you can expect, let's say, this conversion rate to stay the same on that keyword, whether it's 10%, and then you can make all your calculations that way. When we start getting into phrase broad and autos, we start entering into new territory.
So like we're going down the pyramid, we're getting a little bit looser with our keyword targeting, but phrase is still a part of the search query is still locked in to whatever you're bidding on. So if you're bidding on, running shoes phrase, you're only good that those words in that order will appear. The thing to know is like you could appear for men's running shoes or women's running shoes.
So this gives you a really nice chance to sculpt how this phrase should behave, right? To think through how you want this to be presented, right? Is your shoe blue? Is your shoe red? Do you have no variant that's black? You can block out black right away. And that gives you a really cool opportunity there.
Love it. Love it. And then we go down the mountain, not too far, to modified broad. Modified broad has been around in Amazon for a couple years now. Modified broad is something that people don't really use because it's kind of weird. Why are these plus signs in my keyword? And there's two ways to use modified broad. Way number one, put a plus sign in front of every word in the modified broad keyword. So for example, if I have, running shoes and I put plus running plus shoes, it's touching the word. There's no space in between. And then maybe I did like plus men in there too. So running shoes, men, plus sign in front of everything. Those three words need to be in the search term that the person searches. So I could not appear for women's running shoes because I've got the plus men in there and the word men has to be in there. I theoretically could appear for women's and men's running shoes, which is a good use case for negative keywords, but that's modified broad for a plus sign in front of every word in it. That, if it sounds familiar to you, that's how I'm calling it old broad was behaving. So if you like the sound of modified broad match, you should, because it's been the way old broad has behaving, where whatever words you put, lock it in, and then those words have to appear. So that's like the plus sign in front of every term in your keyword. However, you don't have to put a plus sign in front of every word, do you?
You can choose to have a second word without a plus sign, and you can let Amazon replace it, and you can use that as a type of research. So if you know it's running, if you know it's shoes and you know it's running, maybe you want to see how you're going to perform on different types of shoes people could be typing in. Maybe your shoe is like a cross training type of shoe, right? So maybe it's a running shoe, but you've also got some aspects that you can do some CrossFit in it. And maybe you just want to put like sports shoe and you see what Amazon will replace with.
Yeah. So in that case, you would put the plus sign next to shoe, and then let it find synonyms and stems to running or fitness or CrossFit or things like that as a way to do some research. But you have one sort of anchor. That's what like the plus sign is. You're like anchoring that term. That term must be in the search. So yeah, that's a perfect example of when you would use a plus sign only on one or some of the terms.
And this also gets into the territory of, let's say, preemptive negatives. So instead of just letting Amazon give you search terms to put in the negative, you can spend more time thinking through what the negatives should be. So like if you know your shoe is never going to work on a basketball court, put in negative basketball, put in negative football, right? You can spend time thinking through this way.
So yeah, so that's modified broad. And there's sort of two ways to do it. You put a plus sign in front of everyone, or you put a plus sign in front of only one term or a few terms if you're multi-word keyword. And then we get to broad match now, and I'm calling this new broad match, but it's not that new. Basically, broad match as we know it today, which has changed. So if you've been running broad match keywords, go do your homework. You need to change it right away. You need to go in and you need to convert your old broad matches for your sponsor products. And if you want the same thing, the same targeting that you were doing, you need to put the plus sign in there. Very important to do. And we have a spreadsheet for you. Just copy paste very quick. It's the way that it was working for sponsored brands. So I looked at a search term report just in preparation, get all our ducks in a row before this. I'm looking at broad match for sponsored brands. And I won't say exactly what the keyword is. I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 search terms where not every word of the keyword is in it. Like for one of them, I have just one keyword in it. So for sponsored brands, if you do a broad match keyword, it's been this way since sponsored brands has been going. It will give you stems of that keyword. It'll give you synonyms of that keyword. It'll give you potentially related terms of that keyword. And it might also give you a lot of unrelated terms too. It's important to note that you do not see 100% of your search term report. Like if you were to go in and sum the impressions for a broad match keyword in your search term report, you might have like 200 impressions, 1,000 impressions. And then you go into your keyword report, you might have like tens of thousands of impressions. Because don't forget, you only get like a 0.5% click-through rate. And with a 0.5% click-through rate, that means 99.5% of the time you didn't get a click. They don't show you 0-click search terms. So like I'm looking at a search term report right now. Every single one has at least 1 click. So you never see 0-click search terms, which is why it's important to pay attention to your click-through rate. My point is broad match captures a lot of terms that don't get clicks, meaning it appears for a lot of potentially wild things. And I always say potentially wild because they're not all bad. But broad match is like the synonyms, the stems, the related words, the potentially unrelated words. And we need to keep that in mind. So the big change now is like broad match as it stands, after February 2023 is wild. It's the wild search term. It should always have been the wild search term. But for some reason it changed to this sort of more stable modified broad version of itself, but it's back to being wild. So if you've got a whole bunch of broad match keywords in your sponsored product campaigns, I would convert them. I would pay a lot closer attention to your search term report. It's something important to look into. And broad match shouldn't be a big part of your account. It should be treated as the sort of thing that you do when you want more keyword research. So that's our hierarchy from the top, most specific, to the bottom with modified broad in it. I hope we see a lot more modified broad because modified broad is pretty good. It's a good match type. So if you've ever had success with old broad for sponsored products, you like old broad for sponsored products, then you were actually using modified broad the entire time. Whew. I'm fired up, Alfredo.
Me too.
What do you say to people who are like, I'm never going to use broad again because it's like too wild?
I'd say we haven't really put in the advantages of it, right? I've had campaigns where I put like a ridiculously low, like 15, 30-cent bid on a bunch of broad terms, and that campaign will consistently spit out like a 2-3% ACOS.
Mm-hmm.
And that's I think the biggest advantage of broad is that
Find
you
your long tail.
almost find your long tail, but you even let Amazon do it for you, and you can just let it be. The advantage is that the disadvantage, at least, is this 2-3%. It's really nice. It's a good return on spend, right? It's a good ACOS, but it's not scalable. You can't increase the bid, and you're not going to keep that performance the same. So that's why I like having a lot of broads for a lot of products and have that moving around.
Yeah, like you wouldn't want a broad match keyword to be a $5 bid and then your exact is like 75 cents. Because then you're prioritizing this like wild research as opposed to like being more surgical and more precise.
So let's say your category, your exacts are around 2. Like I would expect a broad to sort of be somewhere in the 75 cents a dollar. And then you can sort of treat this like a normal campaign. But I sometimes like going a step further and plugging this as like a 15 cent, 30-cent click. That's like another way of using broad, which is getting this minimum bid. Say anytime I can get a click for 20 cents, I'm happy.
Yeah, it's kind of good because, with the exact match, the advantage is you're bidding for the term and you know what the term is. So like, exactly how much that's worth to you.
And you know how it converts.
With broad, true broad, the way that it is now, the goal with broad is not necessarily for performance. The goal is really to like find new related terms and like do some keyword research and like have that humming for you in the background, so that maybe you graduate a term up to to be more precise in a modified broad or phrase or exact, right? So yeah, so like the way that you're using it is like low cost keyword discovery, right? So I love that. And I think if you're intentional with it, I also don't think necessarily, like let's say you have broad running shoes and then you have exact match running shoes. And like you look at that and you're like, well, exact match running shoes is absolutely crushing it, is doing so much better. I'm going to turn off broad running shoes because the performance is like 80% ACOS. There's an argument to be made there that like, hey, the goal of broad match isn't necessarily performance, it's to really do discovery. So like, can you turn it into a low cost discovery tool for you? And then I think you get into, well, you also want to pay attention to how much of your account is broad. So paying attention to, how much am I spending on broad? What is the performance of broad? And keeping that in a box so that you control it and you're not overspending on broad, because you can certainly do that. You wouldn't want a million keywords in your campaign, all really expensive, all broad, all finding too much research. You want to like control how much you do research at any given time. Off the top of your head, like if you were to maybe think of an idealized situation, like what percentage of spend would be going towards like your really refined winners versus like more broad style research? I guess business goals factor in there, but yeah, just in like a idealized version.
And it also depends on the maturity of the account. So let's say the
Right.
account is fairly mature. I'd want 60-70% of the spend to be on exacts and the rest to be distributed amongst phrase and broad.
Right.
And this also highlights the fact that this percentage is constantly moving every month because we're taking terms out of phrase, we're taking terms out of broad and moving them to exact.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe in the beginning, let's say it's a lot higher because you're just testing out. And then there's those accounts that, let's say, they don't really thrive in a certain category, so they're not going to be number one BSR. They're not going to rank on those top keywords. And those accounts, they might be a little bit heavier on broad, right? Because they have this unique product that's like, let's say it's a fun product to click on. It's creative. It's colorful. Those guys might thrive more on these wider match types.
They benefit from the discovery more. Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm. I would even take what you just said a little bit further, where like 60, 70, potentially 80% of your account is locked in exact phrase, product targeting, and also modified broad now. I'll throw that in there. I think modified broad now is tight. Like it's as tight as phrase matches kind of. Just having one plus sign makes it less tight. But like if you have a plus sign in front of every term, it becomes like we like to use the word shuffle phrase, where like those words have to be in it, but they can be in any order now, as opposed to phrase has to be in order. So yeah, I have like a lot of fun with that. I would put it just in there.
One thing to add, I would say, is when people think about turning off a target in broad or phrase, let's say maybe because AGOS is a little bit higher, I'd always want to be more hesitant. I'd say, hey, before you even turn off this target or change the bid, dive into the search terms, see what's coming out, because there's a good chance that you can make this target work at this bid if you just start putting in a lot of negatives and you start trying to. It's almost like a wordplay, right? Start predicting what terms could come up. If your product is not vegan and you're getting a lot, and you can check your search terms, a lot of search terms have vegan. That was an exact you missed. If you plug that in,
yeah,
maybe this performance is going to turn around.
Oh yeah, so absolutely. I would. We didn't mention it. Yeah, we didn't talk about negative keyword strategy, but like, absolutely should not be running broad match keywords anymore without some healthy negative work. So a great way to find negatives is through n-gram analysis. So especially like negative phrases. So the reason why negative phrases are so good for broad is because broad is now so broad that you can appear for, like you mentioned, like, man, I'm not even selling a vegan product. I just need to negative phrase vegan, and now I'll never appear for anything with vegan in it. And you may miss that if the only way you do negative keyword research is to download a search and report, sort by like, over 30 clicks, no orders, and only add them, because you might have vegan in like 1,000 search terms, all with one click. But like vegan bars, vegan shakes, vegan. So like when you add up all the word vegan, you then can identify like, oh, I don't need this appearing ever. I'm going to add that as a negative phrase. So the reason I mention it too, the same spreadsheet that we have on every podcast episode where you can get all of our episodes organized and all the freebies we've made. We had a great n-gram episode and you can get the Ngram search term report analyzer. It's a free spreadsheet, and play around with it. Broad has changed. Everyone's got homework.
I can even say on the vegan topic, one thing that makes my life hard is I was working for, let's say, a shampoo type of product, and the product was not vegan. It was not sulfate free, but people were putting sulfate free and they were buying it. And it came into a big issue about what do we do here? It's like, we know this product, and they were looking for, I don't know, they would put like avocado shampoo. It's like the product has nothing to do with avocados, but they were buying it. And this led to a strategy of creating, let's say, a campaign. So we would block this out in our main phrases, but we would create a sub campaign that would be complementary products or products that it's not. And we would just throw that in a special type of campaign to see what would come out from it. And then here, I know, go ahead.
Yeah, you just described a perfect use case for broad that you would have found. That's actually the best example that we've had yet, where it's like, oh, like I never anticipated this would be a converting term, or like I wouldn't have found this if I was just, doing keyword research without broad, right? Like that's a perfect use case.
And I don't want to scale the bit on that one. So I know if I'm converting on sulfate free or I'm converting on vegan, I don't want to spend more because it doesn't really match my behavior. But if I can get sales from a campaign that I designate like low bid, low relevance, but I'm converting and getting sales, that was one campaign we had to build.
Amazing. Well, to summarize, the broad in your sponsored products now behaves differently, and you've got some homework to add plus signs to turn them into modified broad to get them to behave the way that they used to behave. We broke down the updated definitions of broad, modified broad for sponsored products and now sponsored brands, because now they're unified. They behave the same way. Modified broad, you can put on one of your words in your keyword or all of them. You can put them on 1, 2, as many as you want, some or all of them. And when you put that plus sign right next to the term, it locks it in, and that term must appear in the search term. So if you've had good experience with broad, I think most people have. I know I have. You've been using modified broad. So I think like what we'll do here is we'll be seeing a lot more modified broad in action, because it is a good match type. It's a pretty solid match type. If you use, if you ever used phrased, if you sort of know what it's like to sort of say like, I want these words to appear in the search result. So modified broad, sort of like shuffle phrase. And we've got some updates and some strategy, and this was good for me. I think I'm a little less fired up now because we were able to hash it out and help the good people of Badger Nation out there. But yeah, there's been no announcement.
We've just been seeing it in the search terms.
Just been seeing the search terms. So there you go. I think we said everything there is to say about modified broad and broad. Alfredo, thank you for joining us.
It was a pleasure. Can't wait to be back.
Everyone else, I'll see you next week here on the PPC Den podcast.